So if I said the word hero to you, what comes up in your mind? Is it maybe a young kid who got bit by a radioactive spider and then suddenly has the ability to cling to walls? Or maybe a Greek goddess who has a lasso that makes people tell the truth and also flies an invisible jet? Or maybe it's a man with a red cape who also wears his underwear on the outside of his pants. Well, those are superheroes. The question is, what do you think about when you hear the word hero? As a matter of fact, do me a favor, if you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook, put something in the comments. What do you think of, or who do you think of when you hear the word hero? Most likely it's not a superhero. I would guess that it's probably somebody who had a huge impact in your life. Maybe one of your parents, maybe a grandparent, maybe a teacher or a coach. Heroes are normal people who make a large impact in the lives of others. And this morning, what we're going to do is start a brand new teaching series called Heroes of Faith. And it's exciting because all of these heroes of faith, you'll find out, are just normal people. They're imperfect people, but their faith caused them to make great impact on those around them. There are people like Moses and Ruth and Samson and David and Elijah and Esther. And for the next 7 weeks, we're going to examine these people, these wonderful heroes of faith, in an attempt to learn more about how to grow our faith and also to be inspired. It's going to help us face our challenges, whether the challenge for you right now is just this virus and everything that's going on, or maybe you're facing other challenges in your life. Now today we're going to talk about the hero of faith, Abraham, and what he did. And we're going to learn 3 things about Abraham that caused him to become a hero of faith. And then we're going to see what characteristics we can glean and implement into our own lives so that we can grow our faith too and maybe even be considered a hero of faith. Now before we get into this, let me give you a little bit of background about where we are in the biblical story. This story of Abraham is very, very early in the biblical record. After the story of creation, after the story of Noah's Ark, but it's before Moses and the crossing of the Red Sea. This is before the nation of Israel. There was a guy, and his name was originally Abram. Now we'll get to that because I know I said his name was Abraham, but at first his name is Abram. He lives in the area of Canaan. That is the modern-day location of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Israel. Now Abram was married to a woman whose name was Sarah. And one of the challenges that they faced as a couple was the fact that they had no children. At this time in history, it was a very, very difficult thing. You needed children to carry on your family name. You also needed children to do work around the house and in the fields and with the livestock. And it's important to know that Abraham had no children, especially when we read this first passage. Look in your Bible to the book of Genesis chapter 15. Chapter 15, verse 6 says, actually, let me start at verse 5. And he brought him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Now this is amazing. The first thing we need to understand is that a hero of faith believes. Write that down. A hero of faith believes. Why is this critical? Because God told Abraham, "I'm going to make out of you a great nation." But Abraham had no children. So how in the world could God make a great nation out of somebody who has no kids? Abraham believed, and the Bible says it was credited to him as righteousness. This idea that God would take something that didn't exist, no family, no children, and make something out of it. Abraham took God at his, and by the way, this is not just any kind of casual belief. This is a deep-seated, held conviction This is the kind of conviction that's noticed by others. It's the kind of belief that is not hidden. And it might actually make you a target to somebody. People might criticize people who have this kind of faith because they believe no matter what. It's the kind of faith you just can't be talked out of. When my son was about 3 years old, he's 21 now, but when he was 3, I remember taking him to his first movie. It was the movie Monsters Incorporated. Maybe you remember that. And it was a huge experience for him. He'd never been to a theater, never seen the giant screen, and he was just amazed by the images that he saw. And when we got home that night, we put him to bed like normal, and he got out of bed sometime in the middle of the night and came to us and said, "There's a circle monster in my room." We said, "A circle monster?" "Yeah, a circle monster." And listen to this. He said, "It comes up out of the carpet into my room." And we said, "Listen, AJ, there's no such thing as the circle monster. I think you're thinking of Mike from the movie we just saw, who was kind of round, one eyeball. That's not him. There's no such thing." The next night, the same thing. "There's a circle monster in my room." We said, "There's no monsters. By the way, does the monster scare you?" "No, the monster doesn't scare me." No matter what we did, we could not talk this young kid out of the fact that there were no monsters. He believed it 100%. It's that kind of belief that Abraham had. And the Bible says it was credited to him as righteousness. Now that's an interesting phrase. Why did God credit this faith and belief to Abraham as righteousness? Well, think of it this way. When you and I decide to believe in Jesus, we have a lot of influences that might help us decide. For example, maybe your parents raised you in the church. Maybe you listen to Sunday school stories. Maybe you have a copy of the Bible at your home and on your phone and on your computer, and you have access to unlimited resources that explain to you who God is, what He did, how much He loves you, the plan He has for your life. Abraham had none of that. He was the very first. No Bible, no church, no resources. God came directly to Abraham and called Abraham, and so when he believed, it was a big deal. Let me ask you this. Do you believe? Do you believe, and do you believe to the level that Abraham believed? Now, I understand. I don't know sometimes if I have that level of belief. I'm going to be honest. Sometimes my belief is challenged. Sometimes I have doubts. That's normal. When your faith suffers, though, what you have to do is ask for help. One of my absolute favorite stories in the Bible about Jesus happens in the book of Mark. Jesus is among the people teaching, and a man comes to Jesus whose son is very, very sick. And the man says to Jesus, "If you are able, will you heal my son?" And Jesus says, "If I'm able? If I'm able?" He says, "All things are possible for the one who believes." And this is the best part, because the man says, "Help me in my unbelief." He asked Jesus right away, "I want to believe more. Help me." A hero of faith believes, but a hero of faith is also willing to ask for help when their belief struggles. Now, the challenge for being a hero of faith is belief is not enough. You have to be able to back that belief up with action. Let's look at Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. It says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who curse you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Verse 4 says, "So Abram went as the Lord had told him." Here's the second thing you need to know about a hero of faith. A hero of faith believes. A hero of faith obeys. The first thing is believes. The second thing is obeys. Now, in reality, this is the hardest part. This is the hardest part because you may feel something in your heart. You may know it in your head. But sometimes it's hard to take action on what you believe and what you know. I remember watching this video about a physical science teacher, and he was talking about pendulums. Now, a pendulum is sort of a weight that hangs on a string or a rope. It's sort of affixed from the ceiling. And if you take the pendulum out like this and then let it go, it will swing over, and then it will swing back. But the laws of inertia mean that the pendulum will never swing back farther than you let it go, right? That's just physics and gravity and all kinds of things that I really don't understand. And so this professor was saying, look, so if I hold this weight up to my face and I let it go, it will not swing back and strike me in the face. And what I love about this professor is he was willing to put his money where his mouth was, so to speak, and show them in person. And I have a little video. Check this out.
I trust the conservation of mechanical energy for 100%. I may not trust myself. I'm going to release this object, and I hope I will be able to do it at 0 speed, so that when it comes back, it may touch my chin, but it may not crush my chin. I will close my eyes. I don't want to see this. So please be very quiet. I almost didn't sleep all night. 3, 2, 1, 0. Physics works, and I'm still alive.
I love that. So here he is, willing to back up his belief with action, put his own face on the line. Sort of like this idea, if you're going to talk the talk, you've got to walk the walk. What does that mean? Well, it means if you believe, you've got to be willing to back it up. If you believe, you must be willing to obey. That's what makes Abraham a hero of faith. He believed, and then he took action and obeyed God and moved to a place, by the way, that he didn't even know where he was going. God told him to go, and he went. It's a good time for me to ask you, do you obey? Let me ask kids out there, do you obey? Do you obey your parents when they ask you to do something, when they tell you to do something? How about those of you that are watching? How about if your boss asks you to do something? How about when the government asks you to do something? Now, I know that sometimes there's some gray areas, right? Because maybe your boss might ask you to do something immoral, or the government may ask you to do something that isn't 100% ethical or you don't agree with. But what do you do when it comes to what God asks you to do? Do you obey in those circumstances? Here's what's interesting. I think obeying God is kind of different, or a lot different than obeying your parents per se, the government, your boss, etc. And here's why. In the book of John, chapter 15, verse 14, Jesus says, "You are my friends if you do what I command you." You're my friends if you do what I command you. This is sort of a universal principle if you think about it. When you do something for a friend, it strengthens your relationship. If your friend calls you on the phone and says, "Hey, can you do me a favor and pick me up and maybe take me to the doctor?" That strengthens your relationship because your friend is willing to do something to back up your friendship. It's the same with God. When God asks you to do something and you do it, I believe that it strengthens your relationship. And by the way, when you do things for friends, you don't do them because you have to. You do them because you want to. And I think that's exactly the same way it is with God, and I think that's what Jesus was getting at. When you do things because you want to, you do them out of a sense of friendship. Wait, there's a big difference between doing something for God because you have to and doing something because you want to. One way might make you a follower of God. The other might make you a friend of God. And that's an important idea. Jot that idea down real quick. Friend of God, because we're going to get back to that. So according to Jesus, it confirms your friendship, it strengthens your faith, and that's a good thing because as a hero of faith, you will be tested. A hero of faith will be tested. That's my third point. Jot that down. Let's look in the Bible to the book of Genesis again, but let's go to the 22nd chapter. And let me read the first 2 verses. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I tell you. Now, here's the thing. This is a really interesting story. God called Abraham. You can take that verse down. God called Abraham and said to him, I want you to take your son, your only son, the only way you would become this great nation. I want you to take him up to this mountain, and I want you to sacrifice him. Now, that makes absolutely no sense. That makes no sense. If God promised he was going to be a great nation and Abraham obeyed, why would God ask him to take the only opportunity he had to have a great nation and essentially kill him? Well, here's what Abraham does. He takes his son Isaac, his only son Isaac, and he takes a servant as well, and they start walking up this mountain, and they collect a whole bunch of wood, and they're walking up this mountain. And on the way up the mountain, Isaac, who's just a young boy, says, Dad, I see that we have the wood for the sacrifice, but I don't see a sacrifice. And Abraham says to him, don't worry, God will provide. And they keep walking up and walking up and walking up. And when they get to the top, they build an altar right there. And then Abraham ties up his son, puts him on the altar, takes a knife out and raises the knife up. And at that moment, when he's about to plunge the knife into his only son, God says, stop. Stop. He says, now I see your faith. And you can put that verse back up. What God says is, now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your only son from me. This is amazing. Abraham was tested, and he passed the test. He got an A. In my book, he got an A++++. Now you're thinking, what kind of test is that? That's a terrible test. Why would God ask him to do that? It's horrible. It's ghastly. Well, let me tell you something. That was Abraham's test. That's not your test. Not everybody is tested at the same level. Now, maybe Abraham's test was so extreme because Abraham was the first. He would become the father of this nation that God promised. So maybe his test was extreme for that reason. But all tests are different. Think of it. Noah was tested with a flood. Moses was tested with the Egyptians and the Pharaoh and the crossing of the Red Sea. David was tested with a giant. Esther was tested by standing up against a king. All men and women of strong belief who obey God will be tested and challenged. And in those tests, they find strength, they find courage, they find perseverance. And they don't find that on their own, by the way. They find that through God. Their strength comes from God. This is what God said to Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 31, verse 6. I'll put this up on the screen. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. God is with every hero of faith on their test. He is available every step of the way. That kind of reminds me of when I was a junior in high school. I had a physical science test. I didn't like that course very well. I didn't do that good. But I remember we had a final exam coming up, and it was on a Friday. Now, the problem was we had a big homecoming game on Thursday. And we all had to travel to that school, get on the bus, watch the game. We got back super, super late. And on Friday morning, we all sort of kind of trudged into school, sat down at our desks looking half asleep, and the professor passed out, or the teacher passed out all those tests. And I took one look at it, and I thought, this This is not going to go good. And then the teacher said, okay, well, I've got news for you. This is not going to be an open book test. And we thought, oh, great. It's even worse. He said, it's going to be an open teacher test. And we said, well, I never heard of an open teacher test before. He said, well, you start taking the test, and if you run into any problems, just come forward, and I'll help you. So I remember getting into the test, and there was one area, and I was like, I really don't know what the answer is. I went up to the teacher, and I said, I'm stuck on this one. And he began to sort of give me clues and remind me of some of the lessons he had taught earlier, to the point where, okay, I remember what that was, and then I wrote it down. He didn't give me the answer, but he helped me remember and find the answer. I think it's kind of like that with God along the way. He's allowing our circumstances to test us. And by the way, that just doesn't mean just this virus. I mean, lots of people are being tested in lots of different ways. You know, maybe the test for you has been a disability or a sickness. Maybe it's been long-time job loss. Maybe it's been challenges with finances or family conflict or marriage challenges, whatever it is. But God allows those circumstances to test you and to teach you. But remember this. He's there right alongside you, sort of like an open teacher test. So my question for you is, how are you doing on your test? Are you willing to go to the teacher to ask for help? Now, I have failed some tests in the past. And I don't mean tests at school. I mean circumstantial tests that God has allowed in my life. Because number one, I forgot to go to the book. And number two, I forgot to go to the teacher. Let me tell you something. If you're struggling right now with belief, if you're struggling with obeying God, if you're in the middle of a test that you feel like you're going to fail, you have the option to call out to God. You have the option to get help from the ultimate teacher. And then maybe when you do, you'll be a hero of faith. But maybe the word or the term hero of faith, maybe that's too much pressure. I was thinking about this and thinking like, wow. I mean, first of all, who would call themselves a hero of faith? That's a term that somebody bestows upon you later. I get that. It almost seems presumptuous. So I've got a better title for us all to ascribe to. And it's another title that was given to Abraham, and it's one that I think we would all like to be known for. Let me give you a little bit of background. In the book of James, the writer is talking about Abraham. And he's talking about Abraham's great faith. And he talks about the fact that Abraham obeyed God, that Abraham believed and moved out and did what God asked him to do. And in verse 23 of chapter 2, he says, "And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness." And listen to this next part. "And he was called a friend of God." Write that down. A friend of God. A friend of God is somebody who does what God asks them to do. A friend of God is somebody who believes what God says. A friend of God is somebody who walks with God and asks God for help and isn't afraid to go to the teacher. So let me ask you, wouldn't you like to be known as a friend of God? That's what I'd like to be known as. I don't need to be a hero of faith. There are plenty of heroes of faith in the Bible, and I'll look to them as inspiration, but I'd like to be known as a friend of God. And I think it starts with that kind of faith, that deep faith, the willingness to ask for more faith, the willingness to ask for help. I think that faith creates action so that we can obey God, so that we can walk the walk, so to speak, and do the things that God asks us to do. And by the way, the things that God is asking you to do, it's not always the biggest things in the world. You know, it's not always go out and be a missionary, or go raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for some ministry, or go lead a Sunday school group or a small group at your church. You know, the things that God asks us to do sometimes are very, very small. Putting the needs of other people first. This is especially true. You're stuck at home like the rest of us. The question is, can you do what God asks you to do within your own family? Can you put your spouse's needs first? If you're a kid, if you're a teenager or a child, can you listen and obey your parents? Can you do it without grumbling and complaining? That's one of the things that God is asking you to do. Can you put the needs of others first? And let me ask you this, are you preparing for the test? Are you preparing right now with work, finances, health? Are you passing or failing? There's no need to fail. Remember, God is with us. And sometimes we need to be reminded of that. That no matter what, God is with us to help us get through the test. We need to be reminded of that. We all do. Well, before we close, let me pray for you. Let me pray for all of us.